Imagine walking through a medieval town at midnight. The church bell has long fallen silent, the villagers are asleep, and only the rats and drunkards wander the cobblestones. But on the far side of the monastery, where prayers should echo, another sound rises. Laughter, whispers, the clinking of cups. Behind heavy wooden doors, monks, men sworn to chastity and poverty, indulge in what was called the second life of the monastery. Yes, monasteries by day were temples of prayer, but by night, some became places of flesh and forbidden desire, a contradiction so scandalous that even medieval chroniclers hesitated to write it down. Yet the traces remain, scattered in court records, papal letters, and whispered tales of holy men who kept their own brothels. In the Middle Ages, monasteries were not just places of worship. They were wealthy estates, owning land, wine cellars, and sometimes whole villages. And where there was wealth, temptation followed. Many young men forced into monastic life were not saints. They were nobles sent away, second sons without inheritance, or even criminals offered a chance at redemption. Once cloistered behind walls, they found themselves surrounded by power, money, and unchecked authority. The perfect soil for corruption. One of the darkest scandals came from 14th century England, where records accuse certain Benedictine monasteries of running guest houses that doubled as brothels. Pilgrims who came seeking salvation often found themselves lured into drunken feasts with the very monks who preached chastity by day. And the women? Many were orphans, widows, or the poor, drawn into the shadows of the church itself. The brothels of the monks were not ordinary taverns. They were hidden chambers, sometimes carved beneath cloisters, where candles burned low and frescoes of saints stared down upon orgies. There, the sacred mixed with the profane. Sacred wine used for ritual became a tool of intoxication, hymns replaced by laughter and moans. In Germany, city authorities occasionally raided these pleasure houses. One report from Cologne in the 15th century describes monks lying with prostitutes as if they were husbands with wives beneath images of the Virgin Mary. The irony was unbearable. Statues of the Madonna witnessing the undoing of vows meant to honor her. But perhaps the darkest truth was how common it was. In France, Pope Innocent III himself issued condemnations against priests who ran houses of sin attached to their parishes. And yet, the business continued. Why? Because secrecy made it profitable. Because men in robes were often untouchable. Because desire has always outlived rules. Imagine the scene: a peasant girl, desperate to eat, entering a monastery at night. The monk who greets her is not cloaked in holiness, but in lust. He speaks softly of God by day, but now his lips drip with wine and promises. And when morning comes, the bell rings for prayer, and the same hands that touched her turn pages of scripture. This was the nightlife of monks, a double life. By candlelight, they were no different from the brothel keepers of the town, but their sin was hidden under the protection of the church, under the illusion of sanctity. Of course, not all monasteries fell this deep. Many monks lived lives of true austerity. But the records we do have tell us something chilling, that even the holiest walls cannot cage human hunger forever. And so we ask, what happens when faith is corrupted not by outside enemies, but from within? When the very men meant to guard the soul become merchants of flesh? Were these monasteries brothels in disguise? Or were they a mirror, reflecting that no matter how high we build our walls of faith, the darkness always finds a way in? Picture a manuscript hidden in dust, its ink faded, yet the words still whisper, brothels within cloisters. This was not rumor, it was testimony. In the 14th century, England found itself shaken by famine, plague, and war. The church, supposed to be the guardian of hope, became tangled in its own scandals. In Norwich, records reveal complaints that monks were keeping women inside their cloisters, not as servants, but as lovers. The townsfolk spoke of houses of fornication, linked to monasteries, where women slipped in under cover of darkness. One chronicle hints at something more disturbing: entire brothels owned by the church, with profits flowing into monastic coffers. By day, the monks chanted prayers. By night, they were landlords of sin. In France, the case of the Benedictine Abbey of Saint-Denis became infamous. Pilgrims who came to honor the relics of martyrs sometimes encountered another kind of hospitality. Tavern-like rooms were attached to the abbey, and rumors spread of women housed there, available for the right offering. One French poet sneered that the saints of Saint Denis are served not only with candles and prayers, but with flesh. What's more chilling is that many bishops knew. They condemned publicly, yes, but in secret, bribes and silence ensured the nightlife of monks continued. Germany, too, held its own shadows. In the 15th century, Cologne officials raided a monastery where prostitutes were kept hidden. The report, still preserved in archives, describes the women found in cells meant for novices, silk beds imported from Italy, and barrels of wine stacked beside crucifixes. The language is blunt. The monks keep brothels within their walls. Imagine the horror of a devout villager stepping into what he thought was a holy place, only to witness candles lit, not for prayer, but for lust. And then came the papal bulls, the official condemnations. Pope Innocent III thundered against priests and monks running brothels. He called it a sickness of the church. But even the Pope's fury could not erase desire. In Avignon, while the papacy resided there in the 14th century, rumors swirled that the clergy themselves frequented such houses. Chroniclers mocked, "The city of the Pope is no city of saints, but of harlots dressed as angels." The hypocrisy became so thick, it suffocated faith itself. One cannot ignore the economics of it. Brothels in medieval Europe were often taxed, licensed, and tolerated by cities. They brought money. And who held the power to tax, to regulate, to profit? Often, the church. In many towns, monasteries owned the very buildings where brothels thrived, collecting rent from the sin they preached against. Was it deliberate hypocrisy, or did monks simply see themselves as landlords with no care for what tenants did? The line blurs. Yet, there are even darker whispers. Some chronicles accuse monks of using brothels not just for indulgence, but as traps. Wealthy pilgrims, lured into feasts, were blackmailed after their sins. Nobles who visited these secret houses of pleasure sometimes found themselves indebted to monasteries, not just spiritually, but financially. The brothel became both a trap for the body and a snare for the purse. Imagine the scene in a candlelit chamber. A monk in black robes guiding a drunken noble into a room where a woman waits. The noble succumbs, and when dawn comes, the monk is there again, this time holding parchment and quill, offering forgiveness for a price. The church had turned sin into commerce, desire into debt, and beneath the sanctity of stained glass windows, the brothel had become a second altar. But how much of this is myth? How much is truth? The problem is that the church also destroyed evidence. Many monastic archives were purged, scandals erased. We know only what slipped through: court records, satirical poems, bitter letters. And maybe that is the greatest darkness, that history's most shameful nights were buried by daylight. Still, the people remembered. In the folk tales, monks became figures of lust, not holiness. In bawdy songs, they were mocked as holy keepers of the red lantern. The memory survived not in parchment, but in the whispers of peasants who laughed bitterly at their supposed shepherds. And so, the question remains: were monasteries by night truly brothels, or have centuries of resentment painted them darker than they were? Perhaps both are true. For every saintly monk, there was another who broke his vows. For every monastery of prayer, another kept secrets behind barred doors. The truth is lost in the shadows. But imagine yourself in that medieval night. The bell tolls for midnight prayer. You expect silence, but instead, laughter seeps through stone walls, and you realize holiness and sin, light and shadow, can live side by side, separated only by a door. And when the door closes, who can say what truly happened inside? The bell tower marked the holy hour, yet the streets outside glowed with lanterns red as sin. And who collected the taxes from these houses of flesh? Sometimes it was not kings, but the church itself. In the Middle Ages, Europe was a paradox. On the surface, it was an age of faith. Cathedrals reached for the heavens, monks copied sacred texts, priests preached chastity and purity. But beneath this shining image lay a much darker truth. Sex was not only tolerated, but institutionalized. Every major city had its red light districts, licensed by authorities, taxed by rulers, and, most shockingly, sometimes managed by the very men of God. Let us begin with Avignon, the seat of the papacy in the 14th century. When the papal court moved there, Avignon was transformed into a city of gold and scandal. it became known not as the holy capital of Christendom, but as a den of corruption. Travelers wrote in horror that brothels stood in the very shadow of the papal palace. One Florentine chronicler sneered that the Pope has more harlots than cardinals in his service. Was it exaggeration? Perhaps. But the records of taxation prove that the church allowed brothels to flourish there for a simple reason: money. In medieval Europe, prostitution was seen as a necessary sin. St. Augustine himself argued that brothels were like sewers in a palace, disgusting, but necessary to keep the whole city clean. The logic was brutal. Better for men to visit prostitutes than to corrupt pure maidens or married women. And so, the church, though it preached abstinence, quietly endorsed brothels. Bishops licensed them, monasteries collected rent from the buildings, and priests often looked the other way. But this tolerance birthed corruption. In England, many towns had brothels officially run under the authority of bishops. The most notorious were the Stews of Southwark in London, just across the river from St. Paul's Cathedral. These brothels were not secret. They were sanctioned, regulated, and operated under the watch of the Bishop of Winchester. Yes, the very man sworn to guide souls also controlled the houses of lust. The prostitutes there were even called Winchester geese. The irony was brutal. The shepherd of souls was also the keeper of harlots. And yet, within this system, monks found opportunity. In some cases, monasteries owned the land where brothels operated, collecting steady income. In others, individual monks themselves frequented them, their faces hidden beneath hoods. But there are whispers darker still, stories of monastic orders running their own hidden houses of pleasure, where the clients were not townsmen, but the monks themselves. The Chronicles of Nuremberg mention one such scandal. In the 15th century, city officials accused a Dominican convent of harboring women, not as sisters of faith, but as servants of the flesh. When investigated, secret chambers were found behind the convent walls, stocked with wine, silks, and beds. The women claimed they had been brought there to serve the brothers. The city erupted in fury, but the church hierarchy silenced the scandal quickly, transferring the monks elsewhere, burying the evidence. Yet the whispers lived on. And then there were the folk songs, the satire that never lies. Medieval peasants sang of monks who sneaked into brothels at night, paying not with coin, but with stolen chalices melted into gold. They mocked bishops as lords of both heaven and whores. For the common people, these songs were a weapon, truth disguised as laughter. Because everyone knew the scandals, but speaking them aloud could mean excommunication, prison, or worse. Now, imagine the atmosphere of a medieval red light district. The streets narrow, lined with taverns and bathhouses. Red lanterns swung above doors, marking the places of flesh. Drunken laughter, cries of women, and the clatter of dice filled the night. Soldiers, merchants, nobles, even pilgrims on their way to holy shrines stopped here, and among them, cloaked monks slipped quietly into the shadows, indistinguishable from any other man. Perhaps they went only once, perhaps many times. Perhaps they paid, or perhaps they owned the very room they entered. The hypocrisy is staggering. By day, these men condemned fornication from the pulpit, warning of hellfire and eternal damnation. By night, they indulged in the very sin they preached against. And when scandal erupted, the punishment was rarely harsh, a transfer, a penance, sometimes even a promotion, because the church feared scandal more than it feared sin. One case from 13th century Paris still echoes in documents. A group of Cistercian monks were discovered keeping women in their monastery, turning one of their guest houses into a brothel. The women testified they were paid not only with money, but with stolen communion wine. Yet the verdict was sealed. Records note only that the monks were reprimanded and sent to another abbey. The women vanished from history, their voices silenced. Even the Inquisition, known for its merciless pursuit of heretics, rarely pursued monks for sins of the flesh. To attack a monk was to attack the church's image itself. And so, secrecy prevailed. How many monasteries lived double lives, pious by day, debauched by night? We can never know. But the fragments we do have show us enough to understand the pattern. And what does this tell us about the Middle Ages? That human desire cannot be erased by vows. That wealth and power, when cloaked in religion, breed corruption unchecked. that behind every cathedral spire reaching to heaven, there were shadows crawling in the streets below. Now, close your eyes and imagine again. The monastery bell rings. A line of monks files into the chapel, chanting psalms. Their voices echo through stone arches. But step outside, and you hear another sound. Lanterns creaking, laughter rising, doors opening to the brothels just across the street. And in some cases, those who prayed by day crossed the threshold by night. Was it hypocrisy, survival, or simply the unspoken truth that even men of God are men first, saints second? We may never have all the answers, but one thing remains. The red light districts of medieval Europe were not just tolerated. They were fed, controlled, and sometimes even built by the very institution that swore to destroy them. And that, perhaps, is the darkest secret of all. Salvation and sin were never truly separate. They lived side by side, hand in hand, in the very heart of the Middle Ages. In the archives of Europe, certain lines of ink tremble with shame. They speak of monks dragged from beds not of prayer, but of lust. They speak of brothels set aflame by angry townsfolk. And they speak of a church desperate to bury its own sins. Let us begin in England, 14th century. In the city of York, court rolls record a scandal that shocked even hardened officials. A group of Franciscan friars, men who had sworn to live in absolute poverty and chastity, were accused of keeping prostitutes inside their cloister. The complaint described the friary as a common stew house, and the townspeople demanded punishment. When officials raided the grounds, they found women hidden in cells meant for novices. The friars protested, claiming the women were servants. But the evidence was undeniable. Bedsheets stained, wine jars scattered, and testimonies from neighbors who heard laughter and cries through the night. The verdict? The friars were disciplined, but not expelled. Instead, they were quietly reassigned to another town. The women were left to vanish in silence. In Florence, 15th century, the tension boiled over into violence. Citizens accused a Dominican convent of harboring prostitutes for wealthy patrons. Rumors spread that even members of the ruling Medici family had visited. When the scandal erupted, angry townsfolk stormed the convent one night, setting fire to its guest house. Chronicles describe flames licking the frescoed walls, while monks fled in panic. Several were captured by the mob, dragged through the streets in their habits, mocked as holy pimps. But the church struck back. Those who attacked the convent were excommunicated, and the incident was rewritten as a heresy against holy men. The truth of the brothel within the convent was quietly erased from official records, though the story lived on in whispered memory. Then there is the chilling tale from Germany, 1460s. In the city of Augsburg, a group of Benedictine monks were caught running what can only be described as a full-fledged brothel inside their abbey. The scandal reached civic courts after several noblemen complained they had been blackmailed. The monks had apparently lured them into the abbey's chambers, plied them with wine, and provided women. Afterwards, the nobles were threatened, pay money or the affair would be revealed. When the case was investigated, it was found that profits from these arrangements had been written into the abbey's accounts, disguised as hospitality expenses. The outrage was immense, yet the verdict once again shows the imbalance of power. The monks were fined, the abbot replaced, but the abbey itself continued as though nothing had happened. One of the most shocking examples comes from Avignon, the papal city. In the early 14th century, Avignon had become infamous as a city of pleasure, where even clerics openly visited brothels. A satirical poem of the time declared, "The Pope sits with harlots, the cardinals with wine, and the city of Peter is no more divine." In 1347, a scandal broke when several papal clerks were accused of running a brothel near the palace itself. It was said that the profits went not to the women, but to the pockets of the curia. A brief investigation was launched, but the files disappear from the archives, likely destroyed. What remains is only the echo in chronicles. Even the servants of God became merchants of flesh. Across Europe, ordinary people sometimes took justice into their own hands. In Paris, 1380s, a mob of townsfolk rose against a group of monks who had been caught visiting brothels nightly. When the prostitutes identified them publicly, the citizens dragged the monks into the streets, shaved their heads bald as mockery, and paraded them on donkeys. But the punishment did not last. The church quickly intervened. rescuing the monks, punishing the women for false testimony, and reminding the people that to insult a monk was to insult God himself. The mob learned a bitter lesson. The church's sins could not easily be touched. The most tragic victims, of course, were the women. Many were poor widows or orphans, desperate to survive. Some were taken in under the guise of service, only to find themselves forced into holy houses of sin. In a letter from the 15th century preserved in Vienna, one woman writes, "They told me I was to clean the cells, but the monks demanded other services. And when I refused, they said God would forgive them, but not me." Such voices are rare because most were silenced. Their names do not appear in history, their fates erased, but their suffering lingers between the lines of court documents, in the bitterness of folk songs, in the fury of mobs who knew the truth but lacked the power to change it. And what of the church itself? Its response was almost always the same: silence, relocation, erasure. Monks caught in scandal were rarely defrocked. Instead, they were transferred to another abbey, their sins buried behind walls. Abbots struck deals with city authorities, exchanging coin for silence. In some cases, even kings intervened, fearing the shame of exposing holy orders. Scandal was treated not as a crime to be punished, but as a danger to be hidden. Yet the people remembered. They sang songs mocking priests and monks as lords of the brothel. They carved graffiti into tavern walls, depicting monks drinking with women. They whispered to their children that not all holy men were holy. And though the official church erased much of the record, these fragments survived, scattered, bitter, undeniable. So let us ask, what do these scandals reveal? Not just the weakness of men, but the machinery of power that protected them. The church feared scandal more than it feared sin. It feared exposure more than corruption. And so, the cycle repeated. Monks indulged, women suffered, townsfolk raged, the church silenced, over and over again. Now, imagine again the medieval night. A monastery stands in the moonlight, its towers reaching for heaven. Inside the chapel, a few voices pray. But in the guest house nearby, laughter rises, candles flicker, a woman sings softly to lure another customer. And in the shadows, a monk slips quietly from one door to the other. The people may whisper, the records may vanish, but the truth is written on the stones themselves. The question lingers, chilling and unresolved. When the shepherd becomes the wolf, who protects the flock? And when the house of God hides a brothel within its walls, can faith ever truly be trusted? Not all sins are carved in stone. Some live in whispers, in the silent tears of women, in the restless prayers of men who broke their vows. The nightlife of monks was not just scandal, it was tragedy. Let us imagine a young girl in 15th century France, an orphan left behind after the plague. The parish promises her safety, food, shelter, a bed in the monastery as a servant. She enters with hope, believing she will serve holy men, believing her life has found meaning. But at night, she is summoned to a chamber not for work, but for comfort. The monk who calls her is cloaked in shadow, his voice gentle yet firm. God forgives us, my child. And so begins a cycle of exploitation, masked in piety. She cannot escape. The walls meant to protect her have become her prison. In the records of Rouen, one such case was brought to light when townsfolk accused a monastery of corrupting young girls. The girls' names are lost, but their suffering echoes still. And what of the monks themselves? Were they all predators? No, some were victims of their own vows, crushed under the weight of desire they were told to kill, but never could. One confessional record from Cologne, 1472, reveals a monk weeping before his superior. "I take the body of Christ in the morning, and by night I take the body of a woman. My soul is split, my prayers are ashes in my mouth." He begged for release, but the abbot silenced him, fearing scandal. The monk remained, torn between faith and flesh, until his name disappeared from the rolls. Was he defiant, broken, or simply forgotten? Another voice comes from England, 1317, during the Great Famine. A Cistercian monk named William was accused of keeping 2 women inside his cell. When brought before the bishop, he confessed not with shame, but with bitterness. "The church feeds us nothing. I feed myself with bread and with her." His words strike hard, survival twisted into sin. William was punished, but not expelled. He was sent to another abbey, the women dismissed. But in his words lies the human face of corruption: hunger, desire, despair. Then there were the nobles entangled in this web. One case from Vienna, late 14th century, tells of a wealthy knight lured into a monastery's hidden chambers. There, he was offered wine, women, and secrecy. But when dawn came, the monks demanded payment, threatening to reveal his sin to his family and the church. Blackmail disguised as hospitality. The knight refused, fought back, and the scandal spilled into court. The records describe it coldly. Certain brothers acted as procurers of sin. But the knight's name is missing, erased. Perhaps his family bought silence. Perhaps the church struck the record. Either way, the cost was clear: reputation buried, truth lost. Now consider the women once more. Many were not simply prostitutes by choice, but captives of circumstance. Widows without dowries, daughters without protection, orphans without bread. A 15th century letter from a girl named Agnes, preserved in a fragment from Lübeck, tells her mother, "I work in the house of monks. They say I serve God, but I serve their beds. I cannot escape. If I leave, I starve." Her fate is unknown. Did she run? Did she die young? Did her body rest in an unmarked grave outside monastery walls? Her letter survives, but her life does not. Even darker are the cases of women silenced forever. In Florence, one chronicle whispers of a prostitute who tried to expose the nightlife of monks. She accused them of turning their convent into a brothel, naming names. Days later, she was found drowned in the Arno, her body weighed with stones. Official records call it an accident, but the timing was too precise, the silence too complete. Her voice became another shadow swallowed by water. And yet, even among the monks, guilt sometimes bursts through. In Paris, an anonymous poem written by a cleric confesses, "I kneel before God, but dream of the girl. Her face is my psalm, her touch my prayer. And when I rise not holy, but hollow." These are not the words of a hardened sinner, but of a man shattered by his own weakness. We will never know his name, but his verses remain. A testament to the torment of a soul caught between vow and desire. But perhaps the most haunting are the scandals that reached high places. In Avignon, it is said that certain cardinals themselves kept women in their residences. The poet Petrarch, who lived there, wrote bitterly, "In the palace of the Pope, Christ is sold, women are bought, and sin is wrapped in silk." His words were not exaggeration, they were eyewitness. He saw the nightlife of clerics with his own eyes, and his disgust burned into ink. Yet even his voice was drowned by the tide of silence. The tragedy, then, is not only that brothels of monks existed, but that their victims were erased. The women left no statues, no chronicles, no graves with names. The monks, even if disgraced, were relocated, forgiven, remembered as brothers. The system devoured truth itself. Only fragments remain: poems, court records, angry songs, scattered letters. And between these fragments, we glimpse lives ruined, faith betrayed, vows shattered. Close your eyes and imagine the chapel at night. A girl kneels to pray for deliverance, but the door opens and she is summoned to another chamber. A monk whispers scripture by day, but cannot sleep at night, his dreams filled with faces he swore to forget. A noble pays for silence, a prostitute pays with her life, and the bells keep ringing, as if nothing has happened. This was the hidden tragedy of the Middle Ages: holiness built on bones of silence, monasteries glowing by day, burning by night with forbidden desire. The nightlife of monks was not just a scandal of institutions, it was the breaking of countless human lives. And so we must ask, when the victims are forgotten, when the guilty are protected, when the truth is buried, what survives? Only shadows. And in those shadows, the echoes of women like Agnes, monks like William, poets like Petrarch, who remind us that beneath every holy stone lies a hidden wound. No institution preached chastity louder than the medieval church, and yet no institution protected the brothel more. At the heart of the Middle Ages lay a paradox. The same church that thundered against lust in sermons quietly tolerated, even managed, its existence in practice. This was not simply corruption. It was theology twisted into policy, faith tangled with profit. The root of this contradiction can be traced back to the writings of St. Augustine. In the 4th century, he compared brothels to sewers, disgusting but necessary. His logic was chillingly pragmatic. Better to channel lust into the bodies of prostitutes than to let it seep into homes and marriages. This justification became a cornerstone of medieval thought. It allowed the church to condemn prostitution in words, while tolerating it in cities. And not just tolerating, it licensed it, taxed it, and in some cases, housed it. By the 13th century, councils across Europe had codified this double standard. The Council of Vienna, 1312, denounced clerics who openly kept prostitutes, but in the same breath affirmed that prostitution itself was a lesser evil. Cities across France, England, and Italy issued charters regulating brothels. And who signed off on these charters? Bishops. The result: red light districts flourished under holy approval, while the pulpit roared with sermons against lust. In London, the stews of Southwark stood as monuments to this hypocrisy. These brothels, lining the Thames, were legally overseen by the Bishop of Winchester. Taxes flowed directly to the diocese. Prostitutes were inspected by officials, rents collected by church landlords, and rules imposed. Rules that forbade them from attending church services by day, but demanded their bodies be available by night. The irony was brutal. They were deemed too unclean to pray, yet clean enough to profit from. So infamous did this system become that prostitutes themselves were nicknamed Winchester geese. In Paris, the church's role was even bolder. Records show that certain monasteries directly owned properties leased to brothels. The rent money was treated as any other income, channeled into the upkeep of chapels, the buying of relics, even the feeding of monks. Thus, the very stones of sacred churches were paid for by the bodies of women in the red light districts. Imagine kneeling before an altar, not knowing the candles flickering above were bought by the sweat and tears of prostitutes 2 streets away. This contradiction was not hidden. It was normalized. Theologians argued it was a necessary evil. Preachers condemned it with fire. But no city dared abolish it. Why? Because the brothel was profitable. Because men of power used it. Because the church, for all its talk of heaven, lived firmly in the dirt of human desire. And yet, when scandals erupted, when monks were caught running their own houses of lust, the church acted as though outraged. Papal bulls thundered. Abbots were scolded. Monks reassigned. But the structure itself, the system that normalized prostitution under holy authority, remained untouched. The hypocrisy was systemic, not accidental. One cannot forget the Council of Constance, 1414 to 1418, a gathering meant to reform the church. Delegates from across Europe attended, and the city swelled with prostitutes. Chronicles say that brothels multiplied overnight, and it was whispered that cardinals themselves indulged. One German chronicle sneered, "More women than saints came to Constance." The irony was staggering. A council convened to purify the church was itself drowned in lust. And yet, no official records condemn this excess. Silence became the church's favorite shield. But perhaps the most chilling paradox lies in the church's language. Prostitutes were condemned as sinful, yet they were described as channels of mercy, their bodies preventing greater sins. Some sermons even praise them indirectly for protecting maidens and wives from corruption. It was a theology of exploitation, a sanctification of abuse. The prostitute was at once demonized and needed, damned and useful. And behind it all, monks and clerics navigated this double world. By day they preached the fiery words of Paul, "Flee fornication." By night, they walked streets lit by red lanterns, knowing the church itself had made those lanterns possible. Some struggled with guilt, torn between vows and desire. Others embraced hypocrisy, seeing no contradiction when the system itself was built upon it. The Inquisition hunted heretics with fire and chains, but it rarely pursued clerics for brothel sins. Lust was forgiven, heresy was not. To question the church's authority was a crime worse than turning monasteries into dens of flesh. And so, the system endured. Theologians debated purity, councils drafted decrees, popes issued condemnations. But in every medieval city, the brothel remained, thriving under holy silence. Now, imagine walking through a medieval town. The cathedral dominates the skyline, bells tolling purity. But in the alley behind, the red lanterns swing, laughter spills into the night, and coins change hands. And somewhere above, a bishop counts the taxes collected, writing them neatly into church ledgers. sin transformed into income, lust sanctified by silence. This was the paradox of the Middle Ages, a church that condemned the body but profited from its sale, a faith that promised heaven while feeding on the flesh of the poor. And for every monk who broke his vows, for every woman forced into servitude, the institution itself whispered the same excuse. Better the sewer flow than the palace drown. The question lingers, heavy and unresolved. Was the church blind to its own corruption, or did it believe that holiness and sin could coexist as long as the prophet was steady? And if so, where does faith end and hypocrisy begin? History does not only survive in parchment and ink. Sometimes it survives in songs sung by drunkards, in graffiti scratched on tavern walls, in whispered jokes passed from father to son. And in these shadows, we glimpse the truth the church tried to bury. By the late Middle Ages, the hypocrisy of monks had become so well known that ordinary people turned it into entertainment. The pulpit may have thundered against sin, but the taverns roared with laughter at monks who spent their nights in brothels. The common folk could not expose them in its courts, nor challenge the power of bishops, but they could mock, and mockery became a weapon sharper than swords. In France, wandering minstrels sang satirical ballads about frères lubriques, the lustful brothers. One song describes a monk sneaking from vespers into a brothel, his rosary beads rattling as he fumbles with his robes. The refrain was cruel. He prays to God by day, but pays to flesh by night. Crowds laughed, clapped, drank, and sang along. The church condemned such songs as blasphemy, but they spread faster than sermons. For the poor, laughter was the only justice they could afford. In England, prostitutes themselves mocked their clerical customers. A slang word, Winchester geese, named after the brothels licensed by the Bishop of Winchester, entered popular language. The insult was double-edged. The women were degraded by the name, but so were the bishops who profited from them. Londoners joked that a man bitten by a Winchester goose suffered not from lust, but from the bishop's blessing, mocking both venereal disease and clerical corruption in one breath. Medieval folk plays carried the mockery even further. In rustic pageants, actors in monk costumes appeared as drunkards, gamblers, or pimps. In one German play, a monk carries a Bible under one arm and a prostitute under the other. The crowd roared because they recognized the truth in the caricature. For a moment on the stage, the untouchable holy men were stripped naked before the people's laughter. Graffiti also spoke volumes. In the baths of Paris, someone etched into the wall, "Here the monks wash their bodies clean, though their souls remain in dirt." In taverns across Italy, crude drawings showed monks in beds with women, labeled with the names of actual abbeys. Authorities painted over them, but new ones always appeared. The streets remembered what the chronicles erased. Even literary giants joined the satire. Geoffrey Chaucer in the Canterbury Tales skewered monks and friars as greedy, lustful, false. His friar character collects money for confessions but spends it on pleasures. Everyone who read it knew the truth. It was not fiction, but reality disguised in humor. In Italy, Boccaccio's Decameron portrayed monks sneaking into the beds of women under the pretense of spiritual guidance. These stories endured not because they were invented, but because audiences recognized them as exaggerations of truths they lived with daily. And yet, behind the laughter lay bitterness. These jokes and songs were not merely comedy. They were survival. They gave voice to rage that could not be spoken openly. They allowed peasants, prostitutes, even pious laymen to vent their fury without facing the gallows. The church held swords, courts, and excommunication. The people held only their tongues, and so they sharpened their tongues into weapons. But let us not forget the darker side. For every laugh, there was a life broken. The satire may have mocked monks, but it rarely saved the women trapped in the system. They remained invisible, their names erased, their stories silenced. Even as the people sang of holy men in houses of sin, the women themselves disappeared into graves unmarked, remembered only as shadows. As the Middle Ages drew to a close, reformers began to shout what common folk had whispered for centuries. Figures like John Wycliffe in England and Jan Hus in Bohemia denounced clerical corruption, calling the church a whore dressed in scarlet. Their words sparked revolts, uprisings, even wars. The people's laughter turned into fire, and monasteries themselves were attacked, looted, destroyed. What had begun as songs in taverns ended as revolutions in the streets. And yet, even destruction could not erase the paradox. The church survived, stronger, reshaped. The monasteries that once sheltered brothels either fell or reformed. The laughter of peasants faded, but the hypocrisy remained engraved in history, too sharp to vanish. So, what do we learn gazing back at these shadows? That holiness and sin are not enemies, but twins, born in the same house, fed by the same hunger. That institutions preaching purity may secretly feast on lust. That laughter may expose corruption, but it cannot heal the wounds of those who suffered in silence. Close your eyes and return one last time to that medieval night. The monastery bell tolls, monks chant in the chapel. But in the alley outside, red lanterns swing, and a song drifts from a tavern. He prays to God by day, but pays to flesh by night. The people laugh, the church trembles, and history records nothing, except the echo of that bitter refrain. And so, we end where we began, with a contradiction too human to erase. The nightlife of monks was not only a scandal of history, it was a mirror showing us that no matter how holy the vow, the darkness of desire will always find its way inside stone walls. The question lingers unanswered, haunting. Was it faith that failed man, or man that failed faith?